as police searched for the bodies of missing children. The Moors murderers were sentenced to life imprisonment for their crimes. 31 years later, should life still mean life for Myra Hindley? The Moors murderer, Myra Hindley, insists she's no longer this woman, the depraved killer whose image has become the embodiment of evil. In a moment, we'll examine her claim to have changed in the 31 years since her sentence. In our film, we'll hear from the relations of the dead children and from many of those directly involved in her case. Home Secretary after Home Secretary has refused to let her go. The latest, Michael Howard, and just today in the House of Commons, Jack Straw for Labour, endorsing Howard's view that for Hindley, life means life. Hindley hopes to reverse this judgment by an appeal to the High Court, which is going to be heard in London early next month. She'll argue there that it's unlawful of the Home Secretary to say that she should die in jail. Who's right? The Home Secretary, with public opinion on his side, or Hindley's supporters who say that after 31 years, the time has come to set her free? John Ware reports.
In the mid-60s, Saddleworth Moor, just outside Manchester, became a secret cemetery. Ian Brady strangled and buried children here. His lover, Myra Hindley, lured them to the moor to feed his sadistic and sexual desires. So deeply ingrained in the public's consciousness are the Moors murders, it's as if Myra Hindley committed them yesterday.
The crime she committed, nobody's ever forgot. At the time, they were the most horrendous crimes ever committed. And I don't think she's changed over the years.
Myra Hindley says she has changed. Writing in The Guardian 2 years ago, she blamed the tabloid press for keeping her demonic image frozen in time.
The truth of this continuing saga cum Gothic soap opera is that the majority of people don't want to accept that people like myself can change.
The contrast between the picture that Myra Hindley now paints of herself and the public's perception of her could not be greater. It's as if they're both talking about a completely different person. However, there is no dispute about the person she once was, as the world discovered more than 30 years ago.
When the police began digging up the moor in 1965, they found 2 shallow graves. The graves contained the bodies of 2 children who'd been abducted, a 12-year-old boy from an open-air market and a 10-year-old girl from a fun fair. A 17-year-old boy had earlier been found axed to death in Hindley's home. Brady and Hindley were tried at Chester in the spring of 1966. The public and press laid siege to the court. Junior prosecuting counsel was the now retired High Court judge, Sir Ronald Waterhouse.
There was immense interest. I was really rather astounded by it because provision had to be made for the international press. There were press from all over the world, and a special room had to be constructed, in effect, adjacent to the Chester court.
The court heard that Brady got a thrill from torturing and killing children because it gave him power over life and death. Hindley was obsessively in love with Brady. Both were charged with the murders of John Kilbride, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. Both pleaded not guilty.
She's an intelligent woman that I think everybody recognizes, and she has a rather statuesque appearance. She seemed to be really rather unblinking and certainly for most of the time quite emotionless.
Impenetrable?
Yes, I think that's a good description.
A tape that Brady had recorded of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey provided the most harrowing moment of the trial. She'd been forced to strip so that Brady could take pornographic pictures. "What are you going to do with me?" she could be heard pleading. As Leslie Ann's screams echoed round the courtroom, Hindley could be heard telling her harshly to shut up crying. Brady said, "If you don't keep that hand down, I'll slit your neck."
The tapes of Leslie Ann Downey's voice will never be forgotten by anyone who heard them, and the judge himself, who kept remarkable control over the whole trial, was visibly moved when he was forced to listen to them. It was the voice of a little girl protesting on the verge of her own murder.
Brady was convicted of all 3 murders. Hindley was convicted of 2 and of being an accessory to a 3rd. The death penalty had just been abolished. They were jailed for life, but the number of years they should serve was not specified. The judge, Mr. Justice Fenton Atkinson, drew a distinction between Brady and Hindley. He said, "Though I believe that Brady is wicked beyond belief, without hope of redemption, I cannot feel that the same is necessarily true of Hindley, once she's removed from his influence." As the trial ended, it was this distinction that gave Hindley hope she might eventually be released. Almost from the moment she was driven away in a black Maria, Hindley has held on to this belief, and that is why the media spotlight has been trained on her rather than Brady, who has accepted he'll never be free. The family of John Kilbride, who Hindley lured to his death, say it is she who haunts them. Brady was insane. Hindley was not.
You think she's worse than Brady?
She could drive. She got the children away. He couldn't drive. She did the driving. She got the children to trust her.
Myra Hindley actually enticed the children away, not him, Brady.
"5 years into her life sentence, Myra Hindley wrote a letter to a friend from Holloway Prison. She said she had rampant gate fever. "I am obsessed with an inordinate desire to be free," she said. From her cell, she repudiated Brady, the god she'd idolized, and re-embraced the Catholic Church. She denied an ulterior motive.
So many people considered my returning to the Catholic Church simply a means of working my ticket, i.e. in the hope that this would suitably impress people and might obtain me favourable release reviews.
When did you get interested in the problem of...
The friend she was writing to was Lord Longford, who in the 70s campaigned for tougher laws against pornography. He'd been visiting Hindley since she'd first written to him in 1968. He believed that but for Brady, she'd never have been corrupted. To him, her religious conversion was genuine.
And every prisoner, if you like to say, every prisoner has a motive for behaving well in prison in the hopes of getting out, but then that's not against them, is it?
No, of course not. I'm just asking you whether the return to the church was a genuine return, or whether it...
Well, as far as anybody in this world can judge, I would have said it was totally genuine. As genuine as anybody else's I could think of. And
not to do with, as it were, working her freedom, freedom ticket?
No, not remotely.
The Moores murder file had not been closed because the police strongly suspected Hindley and Brady had also murdered 2 more children, making 5 in all. But despite her return to Catholicism, Hindley refused to help. Pauline Reed, aged 16, had disappeared on her way to a dance, and Keith Bennett, 12, walking to his grandmother's. Their families weren't sure if they were dead or alive. Hindley said nothing. Media interest in Hindley was unrelenting, and she herself sometimes used the media to advance her case. In 1977, she tried to persuade the world that although she was Ian Brady's lover, she had not been involved with any murders. She wrote to this BBC programme, "I can't afford remorse for the things I have not done." Sitting with Leslie Ann's mother, Lord Longford argued that Hindley should be considered for parole.
Everybody should be considered after 10 years, and she's been in prison now nearer 12 than 11. So I would put her on there. But then the question arises whether she should get parole, which is a different question, and I certainly think she should.
So are you not prepared to consider at any point that Myra Hindley should get parole?
If she comes out, I'll be out for murder if I get my hands on that woman. I've said this to Lord Longford once, and I'll say it again. She will be one dead woman.
Leslie Ann Downey's mother collected thousands of signatures to keep Hindley in jail. The Labour Home Secretary decided her sentence should not even be reviewed.
Because I had to for justice.
Public opinion was beginning to determine Hindley's sentence. Hindley was still holding out for parole, but her letter to the parole board protesting her innocence of the murders was leaked to the Sun. "I do not know the truth behind any of the charges against me," she said. It was one of many leaks from official sources to Britain's most popular tabloid newspaper. That year, with Myra Hindley now in Cookhamwood Prison, the Lord Chief Justice recommended she should serve at least 25 years. It was the first time anyone had put a figure on her sentence. 2 years later, the Home Secretary, Leon Britton, increased that to 30 years. Myra Hindley wasn't told. All he said was that the parole board would review her case in 1990.
Although Leon Britton had held out a glimmer of hope for Myra Hindley, realistically, she was never going to get parole until she confessed and confronted the gravity of her crimes. A month later, her hand was forced, and once again, the press was behind it.
From his cell in Gartree Prison, Ian Brady was talking to the Sunday People. Still smarting from rejection by the woman who'd once worshipped him, he said, "If I revealed what really happened, Myra wouldn't get out in 100 years. Brady now confessed to murdering Pauline Reed. He said that Hindley was involved, and he hinted they'd both killed Keith Bennett too. Hindley was under pressure as never before to come clean. She got a visit from the head of Manchester CID.
I go knocking on her door, and I'm saying to her that there's renewed media interest in this case, and I am going to be reviewing the case in a depth it's never been reviewed before. I tell her that I'm going to go and see Brady again, and I think that that had an effect on her, because I don't think she wanted to see Brady being the person that would be given any help other than herself.
The roads onto Saddleworth Moor were closed.
On the 16th of December 1986, the police began searching the moors for bodies. Myra Hindley arrived by helicopter to help them. She had not yet confessed to any involvement with the murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, and appeared to be keeping her options open. All she promised was to point out what were referred to as places of interest to Ian Brady.
2 police officers were on either side of her throughout.
Suddenly she called Mr. Topping to one side.
I got optimistic that she was going to be pointing out some very specific place on the moor where we're going to find a grave. But having got us to one side, she just wanted to re-emphasise the point that she was there helping and was doing it not in any way hoping for parole.
Did she tell you why she was doing it then?
Really to help my inquiries to try and relieve the sufferings of the families of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett.
Why do you think she wanted to emphasise to you that her motive wasn't parole?
I don't know. I found that strange because, I mean, clearly a motive was parole.
However, she did help pinpoint Pauline Reed's grave, and finally she did confess to her part in all 5 killings. Although she claimed she was never present when Brady killed the children, she did admit she knew she was luring them to their deaths. When it came to Leslie Ann Downey, whose screams Brady had recorded, she told the police, "Oh God, this is a nightmare to have lived with so long." In 1990, the Home Secretary, David Waddington, increased Myra Hindley's sentence from 30 years to the rest of her natural life. Again, this was not communicated to her. 3 years later, Myra Hindley revealed her darkest secret from the moors, why she'd helped Ian Brady murder children. She told a counsellor she was infatuated with Brady and that he'd threatened to kill her if she backed out. But she also admitted the whole experience had held a kind of fascination. She wrote she'd had to explore the foul rag-and-bone shop cellars of her mind.
The work of a lifetime. To scrutinise the mind, the memory, purged of selective amnesia and moral cowardice. One doesn't just have to confront one's offending behaviour, one has to confront one's inner self.
The Parole Board was more likely to be receptive to Myra Hindley's case now she'd come clean. But the then Home Secretary Michael Howard changed the rules for prisoners serving whole life sentences. In future, there'd be no reduction in sentence for remorse. In December 1994, a letter leaked to The Sun revealed that Hindley had been told she'd stay in prison until she died. But although Mr. Howard was closing off her options, her case had already been scheduled for a Parole Board review.
In January 1996, the board recommended that she be considered for transfer to an open prison as a prelude to release. The board concluded she had confronted her offending behaviour and was not a risk to the general public. But Michael Howard rejected their advice.
It looked like the end for Myra Hindley. Her lawyers decided to challenge Mr. Howard in the courts. The case will be heard in 2 weeks' time. But now the fight is also with his successor, Jack Straw. Although the new Home Secretary said he would consider good behaviour, last week he announced Hindley should stay in for life, a decision made before her lawyers had a proper chance to make their case. The fact that Myra Hindley is judged by the Parole Board to have confronted her offending behaviour and not to be a risk to the general public, is that not something that Mr. Straw should take account of?
Yes, I think he should. At least he shouldn't decide not to take it into account. He should keep his mind open as to what the situation may be in the future.
But the effect of his announcement this week means that he will not take that into account now, doesn't it?
Well, that's why I think it was an unreasonable decision.
And unlawful in your view?
Well, it's where a public official exercising statutory powers acts unreasonably, he acts unlawfully.
Myra Hindley argues that an endless stream of lurid headlines over the years has encouraged successive Home Secretaries to move the goalposts on her sentence. She believes the politicians have pandered to public opinion. Do you think it right that Myra Hindley's sentence was increased from 30 years in 1985 to the rest of her natural life in 1990?
I can't see any reason for it. If sentence of 30 years was appropriate then, what's changed to make it inappropriate now?
Do you think that Home Secretaries should be removed from the business of setting tariff sentences altogether?
I certainly do. It's merely a historical accident that the Home Secretary is involved in this matter.
Well, if that had been the case, do you think Myra Hindley would now be released if it had been left entirely to the judges?
Probably is.
But wouldn't that have led to an outcry?
It may have led to an outcry, but on the other hand, justice is better. Justice should be done, outcry or not.
If Myra Hindley does win in court, there will certainly be an outcry. This is Ashton Market, from where in 1964 Hindley drove 12-year-old John Kilbride to his death on the moors. Today, John's brother Danny is seeking petitioners to put pay to any hope of her ever coming out of jail.
What would your reaction be if Myra Hindley was ever released?
Why should she be let out to do it again?
Nothing will persuade people here that she has changed.
I don't see why. She's sick. She should be kept in there forever.
That was a brilliant attitude.
She should have been hung on day one. Correct. I want a what to assign.
Good on you.
If they want an executioner, I'll volunteer for the job.
Yes, good man.
I'll tell you.
Good man. Very good. Very good. Bravo.
The fact that Danny Kilbride collected 130,000 signatures in this area alone indicates just how strong public opinion is against Myra Hindley's release.
Thank you, sir.
She has become such a political hot potato that no Home Secretary wants to be the one to free her. Thank God it's not my decision, one former Home Secretary told us. Whatever dark forces possessed her 33 years ago, Myra Hindley claims to have long since banished them. She says she has served her sentence and is now being treated as if she was a political prisoner to serve the interests of successive Home Secretaries.
Words are inadequate to express my deep sorrow and remorse for the crimes I have committed and the pain I have caused. But after 30 years in prison, I think I have paid my debt to society and atoned for my crimes. I ask people to judge me as I am now and not as I was then.
So how should the decision about Myra Hindley's fate be taken? With us are a number of people who've been involved in one way or another in the case. Anne Widdecombe, for instance, was Prisons Minister, who recommended to the previous Home Secretary that she shouldn't be released. What account should be taken of this concept of remorse or contrition on the part of Myra Hindley?
Well, of course, when you're setting a tariff, what you're actually doing is looking at the circumstances of the crime. And you're setting the number of years that must be served to satisfy retribution and deterrence. Once that period has been served, if it's not whole life, then the only things that you thereafter look at are things like risk. So there is a very distinct two-stage process. In the first, you're actually looking at the nature of the crime. In the second, when the tariff has been served, then the Parole Board or the Home Secretary is looking at risk.
So even when the tariff is over, it's not the moment for automatic release?
Oh, no.
You still remain in jail until...
It would be theoretically possible to have a low tariff, say 10 years, and never to be let out because nobody was ever convinced that the risk had diminished. Theoretically possible.
Has she completed her tariff, or now that she's a whole life prisoner, is there no ending to it?
There is no end to her tariff because she is one of 23, or 23 at the time I left the Home Office, who will remain in prison for life.
And so, in your opinion, there should be no question of considering her release?
It was my opinion when I was in the Home Office, and it hasn't changed, that the particular circumstances of those crimes are such that they merit the ultimate, which is life imprisonment.
Peter Timms was a former prison governor, now a Methodist minister, who got to know Myra Hindley well. Mr. Timms, what do you say about her state of mind and contrition and why it should count?
Well, first of all, I'm quite sure the Minister knows very well. She's said herself that the question is risk, and the Minister, she's read the record, as she must have read the record, knows that there is not the slightest suggestion in the record of any risk in this case. So she is, as in fact the previous Minister, Prisons Minister, said, she is indeed a political prisoner. David Mellor said that to me, and he said to me quite openly...
What do you mean by a political prisoner?
Well, he said that what I'm saying is that there's no justification using the rules normally as they're used for keeping her in prison
just
any
because
longer.
She's not a risk. Because she's an old lady who's not going to do it again, she should be let out regardless?
Well, what he was saying is that there's nothing in the record to suggest that anybody's ever said she's a risk.
All right. Anne Widdecombe?
No, she is not a political prisoner. And what I can say is that when the Home Secretary was acting in a quasi-judicial role, that was exactly how he acted, and political considerations did not come into it. She is not a political prisoner. I did not say risk was the issue. If you listen to what I said,
I'm sorry,
I said only when tariff is over does risk become the issue. And in this case, tariff will not be over, so risk is not the issue.
It cannot, even the Minister, for heaven's sake, cannot believe it is right to re-sentence a person over and over and over again. That's a matter for judges. It's long past when we should give this to politicians.
She had a life sentence at the start, and she's got a life sentence now.
Kelvin Mackenzie was for 13 years editor of The Sun. They've always talked about the evil Myra Hindley, been in the van of keeping her in the front of opinion. Do you think the argument about her state of mind, whether she is showing contrition, should weigh with the Home Secretary?
Not at all, no. The fact is, whether she's contrite or not, she killed 5 children,
And the fact is that she now claims in some curious way to have seen the light and is duping not only God's people, but using God as a shield to get out, makes her even more disgusting than she was before. She has no shame. She should stay in jail until she dies.
She was found guilty of 2 of those 5 murders, and then, as we heard in the film, admitted her involvement in all of them. Bert White, you're a Roman Catholic priest. You saw her, I think, 12 days ago. What do you say about her state of mind, and what account public opinion and a Home Secretary should take of it? Do you think it's relevant?
Well, I met Myra Hindley in October of 1993, and I grew up at the time when all this was going on, and I believed of the devil incarnate and evil monster and all the rest of it. What I find very difficult to reconcile now, knowing the person I met and ministered to as one of many prisoners that I did in Rochester Prison and Cookham Wood, is reading all this stuff in the papers and through the media, and then knowing the woman. It seems to be like there are 2 Myras. I never knew her 32 years ago. I can only speak for now.
The Myra you know now, you're saying should be let out. Why should she be let out if she's committed these crimes?
Well, I believe she's served her time. I believe that the issues of justice should be left to a particular judicial process and not to politicians who have rather dubious motives of vote-catching and pandering to the people. I think that the person she is now is somebody who's quite different. I can't see the 2. It's almost... I can't reconcile the 2 images. It's almost as if they...
Have newspapers like The Sun contrived to give the public one view of Myra Hindley, which is not the view that her priest has of her?
No, I mean, newspapers give the correct view of a multiple killer. And I feel very sorry for the priest for being duped by this clever, clever woman who didn't even confess to 2 of the murders until she thought it was in her own parole interest.
I mean, well, you'd expect Duncan Mackenzie to say that, wouldn't you, really? But in fact, it is just not true. People who are watching this programme will want to listen to people that have met and spent time with the woman as another human being on this earth who's committed some awful crimes. She accepts that. And what she said to me some years ago, after 21 years, when she did confess, she said to me very, very, very powerfully, "I'm sorry I didn't do this 21 years ago."
Anne Widdecombe, Michael Howard and Jack Straw have all said that in the interests of retribution and deterrence, it should be a whole life sentence.
Well,
how do you knock that argument down?
Well, what I'm saying is she's been treated quite unfairly in terms of other life sentence prisoners.
She's one of 23. She's one of 23 with a whole life sentence. She's not
Fred
unique.
Broughton is chairman of the Police Federation. What do you say to this?
Well, I think whatever interpretation or spin you put on this debate, the crime itself was so unacceptable that I think that's quite right. The deterrent of that sentence, which was a life sentence, should stand. I mean, I would go further. I think in the cases of murder of police officers or in murders of this magnitude, then I believe that capital punishment should be reconsidered. Now, I understand public confidence in the criminal justice system may delay that, but if there is confidence in the criminal justice system, I think hanging is the appropriate punishment for a crime of that magnitude.
And in its absence, a whole life sentence is what you'd like to see?
I think that's right. I think in the case of murder of police officers, if we're going to continue to have
let's stick with Myra Hindley. Let's stick with the Myra Hindley case.
But in the case of these murders of this sort of magnitude and wickedness, then I think life should mean life.
Mike Mansfield is a distinguished QC. Do you, Mr. Mansfield, think that life should mean life in any circumstances?
No, I think that what I'd like to echo the words of Sir Frederick Lawton in the film, that really what the public requires and the victims of crime require, as well as the defendants in particular cases require, is clarity. And one of the difficulties about this situation is that when the sentence was originally passed, it didn't actually mean whole life. No tariff was set. And as far as Myra Hindley was concerned, this particular individual, she understood a situation in which a trial judge had said there was a distinction to be made. There is hope in her case, not in the other case. Now, she lived her life within a prison system on that basis. And I think the first point that has to be made very strongly indeed is that if you're going to have a system of justice, there has to be clarity for all, such that at each stage she should have that communicated to her, and you don't have a system. We've never countenanced a system in which you have retrospective justice. In other words, you go back and you look at it again and you keep increasing the sentence. And I think politicians have nothing to do with this, and it was a political accident of history that allowed Home Secretaries any role, because the perception will be that the politician may be influenced, in the present case, by Jack Straw announcing at the same time a lot of early release, and so placating public opinion by announcing prior to this judicial review, and this is the last point I want to make, I think it is quite reprehensible that a Home Secretary in this way should preempt the decision of the courts, which have been left with the duty of sentencing.
And Widdicombe, this argument that she has been treated unjustly because her sentence has been increased from 30 years to whole life.
I have some sympathy with the point made about clarity. And of course there is now a rule that tariffs must be disclosed to the prisoner. The prisoner can make representations against the tariff, and that then the tariff must be reset, taking all those things into account. But of course, once you allow that a tariff can be reset, then you must obviously take into account the possibility of raising it. And one thing, of course, that we try to do is to keep rough comparability throughout the system.
So that you approve of a Home Secretary increasing a sentence after it's been given, if he feels that it was too small a sentence, or he feels the time isn't right?
I think he's got to keep comparability in the system. The point about having a life sentence is that it could be anything from a very few years to the whole of one's life. And we try to look at the nature of the crime and decide on the particular characteristics of the crime.
But if a judge has said 30 years is what she should serve, how can a Home Secretary then legitimately increase that to whole life? I don't understand how he does that.
He can do that because, of course, when the sentence was first given, no particular tariff was set.
No, but 30 years was set at one point.
Was agreed, but subsequently. Now, once somebody seeks a review of a tariff, then there is, with it, the obvious risk that it will go up. And I don't actually find that that is wrong if you're trying to keep comparability between all sorts of different types of crime.
Yes, briefly. I mean, I think we have to go back to first principles, and what we have to face as a society is, really the fundamental question is, are we going to have a situation in which certain types of offences carry an automatic life sentence within which there is no hope?
Let me ask
I don't agree with that, but I think we have to face that.
Anybody in our audience want to talk about this, whether you believe that... Yes.
I mean, I'm sure that all the people I've heard speaking are people who've met Myra Hindley in the past and are thoroughly decent people. But I don't believe this woman should ever be allowed out. I don't think she should be alive to this day.
But you think that that there can be a whole life sentence with no review?
Absolutely.
Does anybody disagree? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd just like to pick up on a couple of points that the gentleman over there said about Myra Hindley and saying that she's a human being. How can you ever say that that woman is a human being? She's the most disgusting person there's ever been. How can you class her as a human being? And also, if it was your daughter and you had to go to court tomorrow and listen to tapes of your daughter being killed, would you then say, in 10 years' time, that person should be released?
What I'm saying is that in these very difficult cases, we should trust the judges and not the politicians. The Minister knows very well that there's not the slightest suggestion in the record, using the normal rules, that this woman is dangerous, as she'd done her sentence. That doesn't mean to say she shouldn't serve her.
But if she's done that to your daughter,
let me answer your question.
Would you
It doesn't mean...
want her free?
Let me answer your question. Doesn't mean to say she shouldn't serve a long time. What it does mean to say is that we shouldn't single her out and treat her differently, and that is what has happened successively.
She's one of 23.
That's what has happened successively. And people like those...
I am personally delighted if she has suffered pain by having the tariff changed on her. If she had thought she was going to get out and then it was denied her, good. I enjoy that, and I represent 95% of this country. People in this country do not want her released. She represents something which I know you as a Methodist minister can't seem to understand, but it represents pure evil.
Something that you don't understand. Fortunately, we have laws and we have judges, and newspapers do not control these matters.
Well, isn't that a shame?
Not to do.
Isn't that a shame?
The man here.
With all due respect to the minister, surely the judges have made as many mistakes as politicians.
Quite right.
Yes.
Terrible.
I think, first of all, the word life has been misused, and most people don't understand when people are given a life imprisonment anyway, and it seems to mean only a couple of years. And I do think there are some crimes which are so horrible that they mean life, and that should be life inside. And I think politicians should intervene because judges are seen in the public eye to get things wrong, to underrate the evilness of some crimes. And when, in the past with Michael Howard, there was an attempt to intervene and to make more strict the tariffs of certain crimes, you should have seen the judges all saying, no, we'd never do that. We don't want our self-interest to be preyed on by the politicians.
Do any of you who are not specialist members of this audience think she should be released, that she should be given parole? Yes.
I'd actually like to go back to the Sun editor who turned around and said
Former Sun editor.
Former Sun editor, it's still the same. Turned around and said that public opinion says this, 98, whatever. Well, public opinion is based on the trash you write in the Sun newspaper.
Well, I don't write it anymore, but thank you anyway for that point.
Answer the point.
The question is, yes, I do believe that newspapers are a powerful medium, and I believe that they are a medium for good. That they represent the ordinary working man in this country, ordinary working man and woman in this country, who often has a voice but can't be heard. So that very word that's being used today, evil, and applying to Myra, has been at the centre of most of the tabloid coverage, and I am delighted to have been part of it.
Are you happy that it's in the hands of politicians and not of judges?
I absolutely am.
Why?
Absolutely
because
am.
you think they're more in tune with public opinion?
There are a number of rather clever QCs in this country, and I'm not accusing Mr. Mansfield of either being clever or otherwise, who would, at a thrice, free anybody from any kind of sentence in return for a large brief fee. And the problem would have been, I suspect, that if the judges had been in control, as your film showed, Myra Hindley would have been on the streets 20 years ago, and I suspect may well have been dead today because of that.
Is it right that Home Secretaries, the politicians, should make this judgment because they're in line with public opinion?
No, I'd like to try and raise the level of the debate here, because it's getting very abusive and very personal, and this is a very serious issue. My concern is that what is demonstrated by some of the voices tonight is a desire to return to a kind of summary justice which is executed on the streets. And the whole point of our society has been a democracy which actually involves a voice being heard, being translated into law. And it is a question of whether Parliament, as the voice of the people, decides in the long run that there should be categories of offence. It hasn't done that yet. But if it was to be done by the legislature, a clear definition of the offences which we say carry an automatic life sentence with no hope at the end, and there was a clear debate about that, then it would be a different position. But that hasn't happened.
Okay,
and politicians are interrupting in advance.
Anne Widdecombe, one very brief last point. Is it the job of a Home Secretary, whether Labour or Conservative in these circumstances, to interpret public opinion, society's opinion, as he or she sees it on the question of release?
Certainly he mustn't make his mind up on the basis of tabloid headlines. There is at root throughout the whole tariff system, not just Myra Hindley's, but throughout the whole tariff system, a strong, compelling necessity to maintain public confidence in the system.
So no shame, in your opinion, if it happens that it follows the Sun's lead?
As I said, we have to maintain public confidence, but what we do not do, and I can guarantee it because I took part in it, what we do not do is let that override quasi-judicial procedures.
All right, we have to stop there. Thank you all very much indeed. It's 18 years since Myra Hindley first applied for parole. The argument goes on next in 2 weeks' time, when she will be trying to persuade the High Court that successive Home Secretaries have got it wrong and that she should be freed. From everybody here in Panorama, good night.